Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Bill Parsons. I direct Carroll College's Constitutional Studies Center. I'm happy to welcome all of you to the keynote lecture in our series of lectures on religious freedom and the American experiment. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you for attending this evening. Tonight's lecture by Professor Daniel Walker Howe is entitled Religious Freedom and Conflict in the Young American Nation, 1800 to the Civil War. It, like the lectures on Montesquieu and the American founding that preceded it, is sponsored by the Apgar Foundation, which has generously supported events like these at Carroll College over the last 3 years. Tonight's lecture is special for all sorts of reasons, including because it is the closing celebration of our year-long program, a series of lectures, panels, student essay contests, student fellowships, and public education events entitled Religious Freedom and the American Experiment. This programming, which has charted the development of religious toleration from early modernity through the early American Republic, has been sponsored by, among others, the Hath God Foundation, generous Carroll donors, and the Office of the Vice President of Academic Affairs. And I'm very grateful for the support of all of these parties. I'm especially pleased to celebrate the completion of this program by welcoming such an accomplished historian to our academic community. Now, before I introduce Professor DJ Cash of the History Department, who will introduce our speaker, I must make a couple of announcements. First, the college obliges me to read the following speaker disclaimer. My favorite and least favorite part of the night. Carroll College seeks to provide a campus intellectual environment that encourages the pursuit of truth, critical thinking, and responsible decision-making. External guest speakers are invited to public events on campus in order to contribute to these goals. Carroll College neither agrees nor disagrees necessarily with the views expressed, but rather provides a forum so that each person attending may hear and discuss the ideas and opinions expressed. Thus ends the disclaimer. Second, I want to remind attendees of the structure of tonight's lecture. After introductions are completed very shortly, Professor Howe will offer a lecture of approximately 55 to 60 minutes. Thereafter, we will have a Q&A session that will last 20 to 30 minutes. In deference to our students, who all have busy study schedules at this time of year, I intend to end the evening's events no later than 8:30, and I'll do, my job is to make sure we keep to that schedule. I will ask that the audience, including the students, remain seated until the Q&A session is complete. This crowd is too big to deal with the distractions that attend frequent premature exits. So that's just a courtesy note. My last job, much more pleasant, is to introduce my colleague, Professor DJ Cash of the History Department. DJ came to Carroll in 2013 after earning his PhD at Boston University and teaching for several years at Emmanuel College in Boston. Most students know him as a dynamic and popular teacher of American history and East Asian history, but I can attest to the fact that he is an excellent colleague, a very thoughtful scholar, and a shameless homer for Boston area sports teams. These are three notable virtues as far as I'm concerned. So please join me in welcoming DJ Cash.
Thanks, Bill, and I am missing the Red Sox Yankees to be here tonight. So. Thank you all for coming, and thanks Dr. Parsons for organizing this exciting event. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Daniel Howe tonight. As a fellow American historian, if much less an accomplished one, it gives me great pleasure. Daniel Walker Howe is Rhodes Professor of American History Emeritus at Oxford University and Professor Emeritus of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. His book, What Hath God Wrought? The Transformation of America, 1815 to 1848, as many of you know, was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in History back in 2008. Prior to that great work, Dr. Howe began his education by getting his bachelor's degree at Harvard University, his master's at Magdalen College of Oxford University, and took his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Over his career, Dr. Howe has taught at many prestigious institutions. That includes Yale University, it includes UCLA for 19 years, and most recently, well, maybe not most recently, but it includes being Rhodes Professor of American History at Oxford for a period of about a decade. Besides writing What Hath God Wrought, which, as previously mentioned, won the Pulitzer Prize, Dan's books include The Unitarian Conscience, Harvard Moral Philosophy, 1805 to 1861, which was based on his dissertation, The Political Culture of the American Whigs, Victorian America, and Making the American Self, Jonathan Edwards to Abraham Lincoln, which I can personally attest is an outstanding book. In addition to those books, Dr. Howe has published some 50 articles, which is mind-boggling to me, who has published two. But there you go, an illustrious career in publication for sure. You may have even caught Dr. Howe on various television specials. He was the historical advisor to the 12-hour TV series America, the Story of Us, which was aired on the History Channel a few years ago. Some of you may have caught some episodes of that. And also, one that I particularly enjoyed, a 2-hour PBS documentary called Andrew Jackson, Good, Evil, and the Presidency. In addition to all of those accolades, Dr. Howe has also published numerous pieces in New York Review of Books, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian Magazine, and other such publications. In closing, just to sort of humanize someone so accomplished, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Howe's personal life. He's been married for 50 plus years to his wife. He has a daughter and 2 sons. Dan enjoys classical music. He enjoys wine, which we did not have quite enough of at dinner, so maybe afterwards we can enjoy some more. And reruns of Law & Order, so there you go. To share. Dan also has 6 grandchildren, and Dan, if you'd like to have 2 honorary additional grandchildren, I'm happy to let you borrow my 2 daughters for a couple weeks to get a nice and peace and quiet. That said, again, it's an honor for me to introduce Dr. Howe. Please give him a warm welcome.
I do want to thank everyone here for inviting me to give this lecture, and especially to thank Professor Parsons for all the work, the extra work that he has had to go to make this lecture tonight possible. So, religious freedom and conflict in the young American nation. In 1800, the United States seemed to have entered a promising period of religious peace and freedom. The degree of religious liberty that prevailed in this country was unique in the Western world. The American Revolution had apparently put the new nation on a path toward religious freedom that might become a model for the rest of the world. John Carroll, the future Archbishop of Baltimore, not the same John Carroll for whom this college is named, but that John Carroll declared, "In these United States, our religious system has undergone a revolution, if possible, more extraordinary than our political one." Americans in 1800 had gone beyond thinking about religious toleration as a goal. Instead, they thought in terms of religious freedom and individuals' natural rights, such as those affirmed in the Declaration of Independence. The original 1787 text of the Constitution was a purely civil document. It said nothing about religion except to forbid any religious tests for federal office holders. The First Amendment to the young Constitution strengthened the commitment to religious freedom by affirming that Congress could not establish any national church or restrict the free exercise of religion. Remarkably, that First Amendment was not controversial. There were so many different religious sects in the young republic that nobody could be so impractical as to suppose that any one of them could possibly make an established national religion. So religious diversity confirmed liberal ideology. George Washington, a revered national hero, embodied the prevailing attitude. He viewed religion in general as a bastion of civility and good order in the Republic, regardless of which religion it was. As president, Washington wrote individual reassuring letters to a series of congregations representing denominations that had known persecution in the past. Quakers, Jews, Baptists, and Catholics. Happily, the government of the United States, he affirmed, gives bigotry no sanction. How modern that expression seems, his use of the word bigotry. Benjamin Franklin exemplified the same attitude. That self-made wealthy man donated money to every religious congregation in his hometown of Philadelphia, not only to each and every one of the Protestant sects, but as well to the Catholic Church and the Jewish synagogue. Catholic Americans benefited not only from the ideology of the American Revolution, but also from its wartime conduct. Catholic France and Spain both became military allies of the young United States, counteracting generations of hostility between the colonists and the Catholic governments of France and Spain. Alas, the reality of American history that unfolded between 1800 and the Civil War did not entirely confirm the expectations of peace and freedom affirmed by liberal optimists like Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, and Archbishop Carroll. In actuality, it proved a period of religious turbulence and sometimes even violence. I want to illustrate the religious conflicts of that era by looking at several groups of Americans: Protestants, Catholics, and Mormons. Two sources of conflict divided American Protestants: theology and slavery. Theological division came first. Calvinism had provided the ideological core of most of the Protestantism practiced in the colonies that became states. The teachings of John Calvin evolved into a carefully elaborated theological system, espousing salvation by faith alone, not works, embracing predestination, the individual's right and duty to study and interpret Scripture, and a relatively democratic church polity in which each congregation often elected its own minister. Two denominations had been especially avowedly and explicitly Calvinist: Congregationalists and Presbyterians. Other denominations also strongly influenced by Calvinism included Baptists, some Methodists, some Episcopalians, sometimes even Quakers. By the early 1800s, however, many Congregationalists had become disenchanted with Calvinism. Predestination proved the weak link in the Calvinist system. It came to seem to growing numbers of Protestants unacceptably unjust. By 1820, Congregationalism had split into two denominations. The Calvinists remained Congregationalists, but the anti-Calvinists became Unitarians. So in the period we're talking about, Unitarians were an important denomination in New England. The Puritans, of course, Calvinists, had founded two prominent colleges in their area, Harvard and Yale. And in this period that I'm talking about, Harvard rebelled against Calvinism and embraced Unitarianism. Yale remained Congregationalist and Calvinist. The theological division had legal implications because Congregationalism was the legally established church in Massachusetts. Remember, that First Amendment only says Congress can make no established religion, but separate states were free to have separate religious establishments, and some of them did early in the independence period. In 1820, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts ruled that towns could choose between Congregationalism and Unitarianism as to which they wanted to establish and support with tax money. Finally, in 1833, Massachusetts did away with its divided and weakened religious establishment altogether, which ended the last of such state establishments. The decline of Calvinism took effect in Presbyterianism a little more slowly because the Presbyterian Church was more tightly organized. But in 1837, the Old School, as the Calvinists were called, and the New School, as the anti-Calvinists were called, Presbyterian parties split the denomination. Slavery in the United States proved an even more divisive religious issue than theology. Whether a Christian could, in good conscience, hold human beings in slavery, especially if they were fellow Christians, this came to loom large as a controversy in religious conferences. Until the 1830s, the morality of slavery was debated in both North and South. Each side in the slavery debate cited the Bible. Defenders of slavery could prove from the Bible that both ancient Israel and the infant church of New Testament times had included slave owners and had recognized their legal rights. The opponents of slavery invoked a more general understanding of the tenor of the Bible, such as the Golden Rule, love thy neighbor as thyself, which, of course, is in both Testaments. But from the 1830s on, as cotton production became more and more central to the world economy and increasingly profitable in the southern United States, criticism of slavery died out there. The debate over slavery became sectional and manifested itself in frequent divisions within Protestant denominations along sectional lines. In fact, the divisions over slavery proved so bitter that they didn't heal for several generations, even after the abolition of slavery. In 1844, the National Methodist Church refused to accept as a bishop a man whose wife had inherited slaves. The Methodist Episcopal Church in the South thereupon seceded from the National Methodist Church. It did not reunite into a nationwide Methodist church until 1939. The Presbyterian Church, which you remember had already divided over theology, broke apart again over slavery. So the New School anti-Calvinists. They split over slavery in 1857. The Old School split over slavery after the outbreak of the Civil War. And in 1864, while the war was still going on, the Southern New School Presbyterians rejoined with the Old School as a unified Southern body. After the war, the Old School and New School in the North combined again in 1869. But the Southern Presbyterians did not reunite with the Northern ones until 1983. In 1845, the Southern Baptists broke away from their national church. The Southern Baptist denomination has remained independent ever since. And today, it is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, the whole United States, with 15 million Southern Baptist members. So much for Protestants. I now turn to Catholics. The American Catholic Church entered the most fraught period of its history in the United States during the 1830s. Ironically, Catholics in Britain had just benefited from a law called Catholic Emancipation, enacted by Parliament in 1829, removing most of the legal disabilities under which English Catholics had suffered for centuries. But in the United States, the increasing number of Roman Catholic immigrants had begun to ring alarm bells for the Protestant majority. Many of the Catholic immigrants were coming from Ireland, a country which, we should not forget, also supplied many Protestant immigrants, especially Presbyterians. As a rule, the Catholic Irish were poorer than the Protestant Irish, both among the immigrants and in Ireland itself. That's because of the anti-Catholic legislation imposed by Ireland's English rulers until it was relieved by the Catholic Emancipation Law of 1829. Some Americans perceived the growing number of poor Irish Catholics as a social threat which might lower wages. These are poor people who were desperate for work, and might undermine American democracy, they feared. Fears of Calvinism spread especially among evangelicals, that is, Protestants who practiced revivalism. Evangelicals based their religion on the free choice of adult individuals to make a decision for Christ, which was not how Catholics envisioned social order. Within evangelical Protestantism, some social reformers embraced the abolition of slavery. Although most of the poor Irish immigrants settled in the North, abolitionism did not appeal to many of them. They worried that emancipated slaves might migrate northward and compete with them for housing, education, and low-wage employment jobs. They complained that their own working conditions were bad, and the sympathy of reformers should focus on them rather than on the plight of enslaved blacks. Ironically, in Ireland itself, Catholic nationalists like Daniel O'Connell condemned slavery. Off in Rome, Pope Gregory XVI forbade Catholics to participate in the international slave trade. But contemporaries did not read his decision as directed against slavery itself. just the international slave trade. In general, the Roman hierarchy of that era did not promote democracy or social reform or freedom of religion in Europe. One book that I've read on religious intolerance in America has put it well, I think. Quote, "Rome did American Catholics few favors during the worst of their conflicts with Protestants." In the summer of 1834, a Protestant mob attacked a Catholic convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The Ursuline sisters in the convent operated a school where most of the students were actually Protestants. On July 28, 1834, Elizabeth Harrison, a nun who taught music in the convent school and was known within the church as Sister Mary St. John, experienced a momentary crisis of faith and left the convent. The next day, she changed her mind and went back to the convent to be a nun again. When the evangelicals in town heard of this, they concluded she must have been forced to return to the convent and was being held there against her will. So they complained to the town council, which sent some of the members of the council to visit the convent and investigate. They met with Sister Mary and the Mother Superior, looked all around the convent, and reported that all was well and that Harrison, as they called her, had returned voluntarily. A lot of evangelical working men were not persuaded. And on the night of August 11th, a mob of about 100 of them attacked the convent and burned it down, while the nuns and the boarding girls hid in the woods nearby. Fire companies arrived, but in those days they were volunteers, and the firemen chose to watch the convent burn rather than try to put the fire out. The following night, the mob returned and finished the destruction. The authorities condemned the action, put 8 of the perpetrators on trial, and convicted only one, a 15-year-old boy. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for arson. He was later pardoned at the request of over 1,000 petitioners, including the local Catholic bishop and the convent's Mother Superior, because it seemed so unjust to single him out. The convent was never rebuilt, the school never reopened, and the sisters dispersed to Quebec and to New Orleans. Year after year, the state legislature debated whether to pay state compensation for the destroyed property, but the measure could never pass. Other incidents of mass violence continued, and not only in Massachusetts. The year 1834 witnessed many more violent disturbances around the country, and the situation just got worse with time. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s prompted more poor Irish than ever to flee their homeland. The violence came to include many more participants and more casualties. Wherever there were substantial populations of working class people that included both Catholics and evangelical Protestants, the Catholics might be attacked and might fight back. Riots in Philadelphia and New York City eventually dwarfed the one in Charlestown, which, after all, not actually killed anybody. By the 1840s, a nationwide anti-Catholic movement had emerged. Sometimes it took the form of a political party called the American Party. Sometimes it took the form of a secret society called the Order of the Star-Spangled Banner. Members of the secret order, when they were asked about it, would say they knew nothing about it. Eventually, their critics ridiculed them by calling them the Know-Nothings. The Know-Nothings feared immigration was strengthening the influence of the Catholic Church. Their proposed solution, and this is interesting, was not to restrict immigration itself, but to restrict the political power of immigrants by confining voting rights to citizens and imposing a 21-year waiting period for citizenship. That movement grew in power until the mid-1850s, when Northern Protestant attention shifted to restricting the expansion of slavery. How far Protestant hostility could alienate some Catholics became apparent during the War against Mexico from 1846 to 1848. When the war broke out, the Mexicans distributed leaflets where invading U.S. troops would find them. The leaflets asked in English why American Catholics would want to serve alongside Protestants who had persecuted them and attacked their churches and convents, and fight against their fellow Catholics, the Mexicans. About a quarter of U.S. regular soldiers at that time were Irish Catholic immigrants. Joining the army seemed like a good job to these very poor people. So there was a big audience for these leaflets. The appeal that the Mexicans made persuaded over 300 men to desert the U.S. Army and go over to the Mexican side. The Mexicans organized them in a unit of their own called the San Patricios, St. Patrick's Battalion. The San Patricios proved one of the very best units in the Mexican army. They were hard fighters. When the war was drawing to a close, 70 of these men were captured by the U.S. Army. Oops. They were court-martialed and convicted of treason against the United States. A capital offense then. It probably still is a capital offense. 50 of them were hanged in a single day. The largest, or certainly one of the largest, mass executions in United States history. When the Civil War came in the 1860s, many Irish Catholic immigrants did not welcome the Union war effort or the drafting of men to go fight in it. And the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to win them over. By this time, they numbered over 200,000 people in New York, which was more than 20% of the city's population of 1 million. In the summer of 1863, Irish Catholic immigrants in New York City created mob violence of their own, protesting against the draft, and in particular against the provision that men who could afford to pay $300 were exempt from the draft. The mobs quickly turned to attacking scapegoats, like the free black inhabitants, or white people who supported the abolition of slavery. They burned the draft office and many homes. They burned 2 Protestant churches and the colored orphan asylum. By nightfall, the rebels controlled the city. The gigantic riot was only suppressed when federal troops were rushed to the city from the battlefield at Gettysburg, where they had just won their biggest victory of the Civil War. 120 people had been killed in the riot and over 300 injured. But despite this horror, New York City also hosted the most constructive influence in building an American Catholic Church. This influence was embodied in John Hughes, a working-class Irish immigrant who was created diocesan bishop in 1842 and promoted to Archbishop of New York in 1850. Firmly asserting his ecclesiastical authority, Hughes became known as Dagger John, ostensibly because the bishop's cross he always drew after signing his name looked something like a dagger. But it was also an expression of respect for his militant toughness. He successfully coped with political party rivalries and battles over the Protestant nature of the public schools at the time. He encouraged his people toward hard work, personal discipline, including temperance, interestingly enough, and acceptance of the American way of life and upward social mobility. He began the work on the great St. Patrick's Cathedral on Fifth Avenue. To design it, he hired America's leading architect of the Gothic Revival, who was a Protestant, James Renwick. Hughes backed his nation's war against Catholic Mexico and the Union's war effort against the Southern Confederacy. He combined his staunch American patriotism with staunch devotion to a 19th century papacy that was deeply suspicious of all liberalism, including Americanism. Under Hughes's leadership and that of other bishops who followed his example, Catholicism continued to grow in the United States until, in the later 19th century, it finally surpassed Methodism to become the country's largest Christian denomination. For all the turmoil associated with the history of Roman Catholicism in the United States, it was not the denomination with the most violent history. That tragic distinction belongs to the Mormons. The Book of Mormon was published in 1830 by one Joseph Smith, Jr., who claimed he had translated it from ancient documents written on golden plates that he had unearthed from a hill in upstate New York. The documents constituted the scriptures of a lost tribe of Israel who had crossed to the Atlantic in biblical times and had even been visited by Jesus Christ. Smith said an angel named Moroni had told him where to find them. Smith also claimed to have been visited personally by Jesus Christ, who warned that his second coming would occur soon. If Jesus was returning quickly, then Smith felt it his mission to warn people that they were living in the latter days of history. By the end of 1830, over 200 people had been converted by Smith and baptized into what he called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They were commonly nicknamed Mormons for their holy book. By 1835, they numbered some 4,000. Mormons consider themselves children of Israel and refer to non-Mormons as Gentiles. The Mormons typically gathered together in communities of their own. Two such communities formed in the early 1830s, one in Kirkland, Ohio, and one in western Missouri. But When the bank that Joseph Smith founded in Kirtland went broke, the authorities there pursued him for fraud. The prophet decided his community should leave and consolidate in Missouri. The move from Ohio to Missouri proved a flight from the frying pan into the fire. In Missouri, the Mormons were subjected to a campaign of frontier terror, including robberies, floggings, and burnings. The Mormons' neighbors hated their religion, feared their economic communalism, and resented their alien Yankee background. Most Missourians were Southerners. The Missourians became really hostile when the Mormons tried to convert local Indians to Mormonism. The reinforcements from Kirtland brought the number of Mormons in Missouri up to about 10,000. Some of the Mormon men organized a paramilitary group called the Danites for self-defense and reprisals. In August of 1838, when a Mormon man was denied the right to vote at a polling place, a riot broke out. A series of violent encounters between Danites and Gentiles ensued, and historians refer to it collectively as the Mormon War of 1838. Governor Lilburn Boggs, who had ignored years of recurrent violence so long as the victims were all Mormons, now called up state troops to crush what he considered a Mormon rebellion. On October 27, 1838, the governor issued this order to his militia, quote, "The Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace," unquote. On November 1st, the prophet ordered his people to lay down their arms. The Mormon War had cost the lives of one Gentile and at least 40 Mormons. Now the Danites watched as Gentiles looted their homes and slaughtered their livestock. The Mormons sold their farms for a fraction of their worth and fled across the Mississippi River to Illinois. There, the refugees built up another new community, an even larger one, which they called Nauvoo, Hebrew for a beautiful place. By 1842, the population of Nauvoo, historians estimate, had reached 10,000, which was twice the population of Chicago at that time. Joseph Smith was accorded virtually dictatorial power over the city by the Illinois state legislature, which was eager to promote the immigration of hardworking people. He laid out wide city streets and began work on a new Mormon temple. In early 1844, Joseph Smith decided to run for President of the United States. He laid out an ambitious platform, which included federal money for compensating slave owners, for emancipating their slaves, if their states chose to take advantage of it. Many Gentiles concluded that Smith had fallen into megalomania. The prophet did not live to participate in the election. In June of 1844, a group of dissident Mormons had set up a newspaper in Nauvoo and publicized the fact that Smith and a few of his intimates had been practicing polygamy. This was true, but Smith did not feel the time was right to reveal it. He used his power over the Nauvoo City Council to seize and destroy the new press. The Mormon assault on freedom of the press aroused unanimous condemnation from the Illinois press, as you might expect. Instead of being victims of religious persecution, the Mormons now seemed to be its perpetrators. Militia units were organized in 2 neighboring towns and announced their intention to restore law and order in Nauvoo by force, which of course exceeded their authority. The Mormons organized to resist. The governor of Illinois hastened to the scene to forestall a civil war. Smith agreed to disband the Nauvoo Legion, but the governor also insisted that he personally submit to arrest for the unwarranted destruction of the dissident press. While in custody in the town of Carthage, Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were murdered by a lynch mob. The mob consisted of members of one of those 2 militia units. The other, by prearrangement, made a pretended show of defense and then fled. The Illinois press perfunctorily deplored the murders. The governor secured indictments against some members of the mob, but not convictions. The Mormons did not fight back. Under their new leader, Brigham Young, they arranged with the Illinois authorities to leave the state and flee west. With practically everyone in Nauvoo selling their home and belongings at the same time, the Mormons took another financial beating, just as they had done in Missouri. Brigham Young, a practical, decisive leader, chose his people's route to the Salt Lake Valley very well and organized their migration with impressive efficiency. At the time the Mormons crossed the plains in 1846, Utah was not yet part of the United States. It was included in the land ceded by Mexico at the end of the Mexican War in 1848. In 1850, Congress recognized Utah as a territory, and President Fillmore recognized Mormon self-rule by appointing Brigham Young the territorial governor. Even so, however, conflict eventually resumed between the Mormons and both the federal government and their Gentile neighbors. In 1857, President Buchanan decided to replace Young with a non-Mormon territorial governor. To enforce this appointment, he sent several thousand federal troops to Utah, but he did not reveal to the Mormons the purpose of their expedition. When they learned of the army's approach, the Mormons prepared to defend themselves. Only just barely was armed conflict avoided and Buchanan's appointee peacefully installed. Meanwhile, away in southern Utah, a party of non-Mormons were crossing the state on their way to California. They were massacred by local Mormons at a place called Mountain Meadows in September of 1857. The Mormons seem to have thought the travelers were associated with the federal army invasion. 120 people were killed. 17 small children were spared and adopted by local Mormon families. The Mormon militia members who committed the massacre had collaborated with Paiute Indians and tried to arrange that the Indians would bear the entire blame. 20 years later, one leader of the Mormon perpetrators was convicted of murder and executed. Bitter relations with the federal government continued because of the Mormon practice of polygamy, which was contrary to federal law by an act of Congress passed in 1862. The Mormons maintained that their practice of polygamy constituted a free exercise of religion guaranteed by the First Amendment. In 1879, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment applied only to religious belief, not to practice, and polygamy was therefore not protected. For the next 11 years, prosecutions for polygamy sent many Protestant Mormon men to prison. They never prosecuted women. In 1890, the president of the Latter-day Saint Church, that is the successor to Brigham Young, issued a manifesto renouncing polygamy out of respect for the law of the land. Polygamy is still considered to enjoy divine sanction in the hereafter. In 1896, after the Mormon Church had begun to excommunicate men who continued to take plural wives, Utah gained admission as a state. The Mormons' way of life, originally a collectivist, authoritarian dissent from American individualistic pluralism, today generally impresses observers as a very American way. Catholics and Mormons alike have successfully adapted to American culture. Or maybe American culture has adapted successfully to practice a religious freedom that it has always endorsed in principle. As an example of how much things have changed, I can't resist pointing out this very dramatic transformation. In the 19th century that I've been discussing, evangelicals were usually the Protestants most hostile to Catholicism. Yet today, the very opposite political alignment prevails. Catholics and evangelicals have found themselves as political allies across a series of issues, including anti-communism, the censorship of obscenity, divorce, homosexuality, assisted suicide, birth control, and the right of the unborn to life. Things can and do change. Thank you very much. So now, as I understand it, we are to welcome questions, comments, and the like. So I'm no longer giving a lecture. I'm just going to hear questions and comments and maybe respond. Yes, sir.
You spoke of religious persecution against the Mormons in Utah and Catholics in the United States, like the Northeast. Was there any religious persecution against Protestants in Utah or Protestants in the Catholic colony of Maryland in this time period?
Well, okay, the Catholic rioters in New York City burned down 2 Protestant churches,
Yeah.
As well as the Black Orphanage. The Mormons in Utah, I don't think they singled out Protestants, but they certainly tried to minimize the political influence of all Gentiles.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How did the Anglican religion respond to the sudden break, I think, when that happened after the American Revolution?
Oh, that's a nice question. Did everybody hear it? Did you hear the question? Okay. The question was, how did the Anglican Church respond to the American Revolution with independence from Britain? Okay? Well, a lot of prominent American pro-revolution patriots were themselves members of the Anglican Church. And George Washington is a very good example, okay? But so were Patrick Henry and lots of people, okay? So they could support either side, but the Tories, the people who supported the British, certainly did include a disproportionately large number of Anglicans, okay? When independence came, the Anglicans asserted the independence of their denomination. It was no longer going to be part of the diocese of the Anglican Bishop of London, okay? So they called their church, first they called it the Protestant Episcopal Church, and the name has later changed to just plain Episcopal Church, okay? So Episcopalians in America today are Anglicans. I'm an Episcopalian, by the way, if you wonder whether anybody is still today. It was kind of awkward to get a bishop consecrated for the created for this new Episcopal Church, because you would think that he would go to England and get consecrated by some English Anglican bishops. But oops, there was a law on the books at the time in England that anybody who was going to be consecrated a bishop in the Church of England had to swear allegiance to the crown. So that's not going to work. But somebody thought, okay, we've got a solution to that. So this first American Anglican bishop went up to Scotland, where the Episcopal Church in Scotland is what it's called. It's religiously Anglican, but it's not the established Church of Scotland. The established Church of Scotland is the Presbyterian Church. When the Queen takes a vacation and goes up to Scotland, she becomes a Presbyterian while she's there. She would go to a Presbyterian Church of Scotland church on Sunday. When she comes back to London, she's back an Anglican again. So, there was no reason why a bishop in the Church of Scotland couldn't consecrate an American bishop. So that's what was done. Pretty soon, the English got rid of the law that said they could only consecrate bishops who swore allegiance to the British crown. Anyway, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Now, okay, no, there's one other relevant point. Anglicanism had been the established church in several of the colonies, including the southern part of the state of New York, where New York City is, and Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. However, at the time of the Revolution, when people were escaping from everything British, it was easy and quick to abolish those religious establishments. What stuck around longer were the congregational religious establishments in Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Connecticut. The Congregationalist Church had been strongly pro-revolution, so there didn't seem to be any reason why the Patriots would say they had to be disestablished. In fact, they were disestablished at different years after independence. Yes?
You mentioned the Mormons opposed the abolition movement. How did they respond to civil rights and following legislation after that?
Well, slavery was legal in Utah Territory during that period, although there were very, very few slaves in Utah. I think there were a couple of black men with the very first party of Mormons crossing the plains, and they were the slaves of a southern slave owner who had converted to Mormonism and went to Utah bringing along his slaves. Okay. You're asking how they have responded to civil rights like in the 20th century and so forth, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, there were some problems for the Mormon church that was kind of left over from early years. There was a passage in the Book of Mormon which said that if Native American tribes would convert to Mormonism, that their members would become a white and delightsome people. That would be their reward. Well, by the time you're in the 20th century, this doesn't grab one's admiration as a quotation from the Book of Mormon. The Mormon Church then appointed a committee which looked into the matter and decided that, hey, it was all a mistake. The printer who had been printing the first edition of the Book of Mormon, it should have read a free and delightsome people, but the printer had made a mistake. He'd heard the expression, white and delightsome, so he thought that that's what it should be. So they changed the words in the Book of Mormon, okay? Another thing, too, you know that most Mormon men are priests within the Mormon church. They're ordained at various levels, like when they're 12 and then at other later times. But black Mormons were not allowed to be priests. They had to just be members of the church. Well, this was changed too in the course of sometime in the mid-20th century. The president of the church decided that it was within his power to say, no, this applies to all men who are Mormons, regardless of their race. So those two issues did come up. Yes?
You mentioned the Archbishop of New York's increase in patriotism and ecumenism.
Yes, he was very liberal politically.
And I wonder if this actually improved Protestant-Catholic relations, and if so, to what extent did it draw the ire of Rome?
Well, okay, it certainly did improve Protestant-Catholic relations. But Rome preferred to ignore this. When was the Syllabus of Errors published?
1862? I think 1862.
1862. So as late as 1862, the papacy is still treating liberalism as part of what they called Americanism and what was heretical. And this is spelled out in this document that we were talking about. So, and when you get to Archbishop Hughes, he's very clear that he sticks by whatever the papacy declares, but he's also very good at doing things that promote the interests of his own Catholic people and kind of shutting out temporarily issues debating with Rome. Of course, such issues persist until the Second Vatican Council. And as late as 1960, when John F. Kennedy was nominated for president, his religion was a political issue. Interestingly, it was successfully resolved so that when John Kerry ran for president, and he was a Catholic too, nobody talked about that or seemed to feel it was an issue. So that what was still an important issue in 1960, within relatively few years, nobody would even dream of raising it as an issue.
Except we haven't had a Catholic president since John Kennedy. So I
We
wonder
haven't.
if
We
it's
haven't.
really not an issue, or
We
if it
haven't.
is an
Well,
issue. People just started talking about it in the same
But
way.
when Kerry ran and was a Catholic,
But there was stuff about it being
nobody said,
excommunicated and
"Oh, you
stuff.
can't have a Catholic president."
No, I just remembered there
Yeah.
was stuff about him not being able to take communion and because of his beliefs on abortion, and so there was talk.
Yeah.
There was talk about
Well,
that.
it was a tough position for him because he wanted to be able to take stands that would keep him aligned with Democratic Party members, which was awkward. But, of course, millions and millions of Americans have managed to vote Democratic and attend the Catholic Church. Yeah. You, sir.
What kind of problems were raised after the Jefferson Davis was given a letter, returned a letter by Pope Pius? I know I've read about that. He was returned a letter, Your Excellency, President. That cause any problems with Northern Catholics, with Rome recognizing the Southern Presidency in such a way?
That's a wonderful question. I have to say, I guess I don't really know the answer. The Confederacy was very keen to, well, they would be happy if anybody would recognize their independence, but to get the Pope to do so would be really terrific. Remember, the Pope still rules the Papal States in central Italy. He's not just a tiny Vatican City. I think he was pleased to be addressed as Your Excellency, but it didn't produce the next step. He wasn't actually recognized as an independent country as he had hoped. Probably the papacy would have liked if the Confederacy had maintained its independence successfully, because it would have shown that the American political system didn't really work. It could crumble. And after all, once 11 southern states had seceded, other states would probably have found other reasons to see why they should secede too. I mean, it really could have heralded a long-term process of disintegration, and the United States would have come to resemble the Balkans. And of course, the problem in the Balkans is that once upon a time, the Balkans were all united under Turkish rule, and then for a time they were all united under Austrian rule. And now they're all independent and constantly fighting each other and persecuting each other's peoples and stuff. That makes you shudder. Yeah.
I just wanted to mention Romney. I think that there was probably, because he was Mormon, I don't know if there were other Mormons who ran for president, but I think there was some prejudice against him because he was Mormon.
I think there probably was, although an awful lot was not made of it, but maybe it didn't have to be in public. I think it probably was a disadvantage to him.
I think so.
Yeah. Yes, sir, and then madam behind you next.
I think very early, there were Sephardic Jews in Rhode Island.
Oh, yes.
And I'm wondering, I don't know if the research has been done, if you've done the research, do you have any comments on how Jews function, say from whatever, 1791 to the Civil War? Was there hostility here? How did they operate?
There were and still remain Jewish congregations that go all the way back to colonial times in Newport, Rhode Island. I think the ones in Philadelphia and Charleston, South Carolina also go back to colonial times. They generally welcomed the American Revolution. When later, by the time the reform movement is underway, which it's barely underway near the end of the period I was talking about, Orthodox Jews tend to support the Democratic Party and Reform Jews the Republican Party, because the Reform Jews are very much into social reform movements like anti-slavery, right? Whereas the Orthodox Jews thought that the principal issue was the preservation of Judaism, and that was safer if the Democrats were in power than if the Republicans were in power, because remember, the Republicans at that time are the party of social reform, and everything from public schools to orphanages to anti-slavery to the temperance movement and so on. Those are all associated with the Republican Party, and the Orthodox, that worries the Orthodox Jews. So they stick with the other party.
Okay.
Oh, ma'am? Yeah.
So you mentioned that the Book of Mormon had written that Native Americans who converted would become whiter, or would become white, and then they erased that. And then you also mentioned that the Mormons who killed the settlers who were attempting to go to California, they blamed it on the Mormons, and they blamed it on the Native Americans. And I'm wondering what happened to the Native Americans in the Salt Lake Valley. Did many convert, or did many?
Very few Native Americans have converted to Mormonism. Could you people at that corner of the room hear the lady at this corner of the room? Okay, cool. The Mormons from time to time have taken an interest in converting the American Indians, but it's never been a big success. And there's always been this element within the attitudes of ordinary Mormons that tend to be white, kind of white supremacist, although I don't mean that in a very aggressive way, but yeah. Yes?
So I was just going to ask, so I've read a bunch of anti-Mormon novels that came out in the 19th century. And in a lot of the anti-Mormon writings, I'm just curious, talking about issues of race, they talk about the Mormons as if they're other races, as if they're not white. And it's so interesting to me that this was part of the anti-Mormon dialogue that they're not even white. So yes, you want to comment on that?
Well, I'm afraid I don't know this literature, so until you told us just now, I didn't know
There's a lot
that some
saying that
anti-Mormons saw the Mormons as not being white.
There was a lot about it.
Yeah.
Mark Twain actually wrote about how Mormons were so ugly that it was good that they were polygamous, because who would marry those women? So there was a lot about how they looked. You could find articles on the Mormon eye that it's different than anybody else's eyes. So there was a lot of racial discourse as part of it.
Yeah, well, that would be characteristic of the 19th century preoccupation with what they thought of as genetics. But I don't think they yet understood what genes are, but yeah. And of course, there's a lot of people who think that the shape of your skull, determines how intelligent you are and stuff like that. Yeah, there's a lot of that. Yes, sir.
I just wanted to comment as a Mormon myself that in the LDS Church there's over 16 million members, and there's more members outside of the United States.
Yes, there are. You're right.
And that there's a tremendous group in Africa.
Yeah.
There is no, as far as I can tell, any bigotry or attitudes that are being portrayed. And I just wanted to clarify that.
Well, good. I'm glad you did, and it shows how successful the Mormon Church has been in eliminating these remnants of white supremacy or something that were there in the 19th century, which is not surprising or yeah. Yes, sir, way back.
Yeah, the period of time you addressed tonight, I believe, was also concurrent with the Second Great Awakening. Could you discuss how that played into this?
Okay. Yeah, the Second Great Awakening. Yes, okay. The Second Great Awakening is an early 19th century phenomenon. It's usually thought of as starting in 1800 with religious revivals. And it's a big deal all the way, certainly, through the 1830s. And so the evangelicals, if we can use that word to describe the people who are into this kind of religion, it's a very growing, exciting kind of Christianity. And it begins in upstate New York, and western New England, and then spreads all around. It becomes very important in Kentucky, for example. People will travel for several days to get to the place where there's going to be a revival. And they were called camp meetings. They were called camp meetings because the people who went there would bring along a tent and camp out so that the family could stay there for several days. During the days, there would be preachers talking about the importance of making a decision for Christ, and singing and so forth. And people would get excited and they would come up and make a decision. The events came to be social events as well as religious ones, because people would go not only to affirm their faith in Christ, but also because Sister so-and-so, whom I haven't seen for a long time, I know she and her family are coming there too, see, and it'll be great for us to get together again. So, and they come to foster not only making decisions for Christ, but they also convince people, for example, that they ought to take a vow of temperance. Remember that alcoholism is a huge social problem, a real objective social problem in these days. And women in particular are worried about, because men get drunk and go home and beat up their wives, or maybe even their children. So the women are very concerned with this. And remember, it's called the temperance movement. Remember, the word temperance means moderation. So then the advocates of temperance, they come to want to make more dramatic, elicit more dramatic decisions. So they think it would be neat if you'd sign this pledge. It'll be even more neat if you sign the pledge and put a T, a capital T, after your name. That means that you're promising not just moderation, but total abstinence. Okay? So we got the word teetotaler out of that. Somebody who would write a signature on the pledge, put a T after it, was a teetotaler. Okay, so the evangelicals continue to support temperance more and more. And in 1850, the state of Maine makes it illegal to buy alcoholic beverages. And from then on, one by one, other states begin to make the same choice. And eventually the temperance gets enough support. And the women in particular are agitating for it, just as they're agitating for women's right to vote. And early in the 20th century, they make two really big victories. The 18th Amendment is national prohibition, and the 19th Amendment gives women the right to vote. Of course, after just a few years, people become disillusioned with nationwide prohibition. And it gets repealed in the 21st Amendment. They haven't repealed the 19th Amendment. One other comment I might make about the 19th Amendment. Bear this in mind. The 19th Amendment mandated that women should have the right to vote everywhere in the United States, but lots and lots of states had already given their women citizens the right to vote. And it was the Western states that led in giving women the right to vote. And one of these Western states that very early on gave women the right to vote was Utah. Utah. Now, giving women the right to vote in Utah had political implications, okay? Utah in the 19th century didn't function so much on Democrats versus Republicans as on Mormons versus Gentiles, okay? Now, there were a lot more Mormon women in Utah than Gentile women. So, some clever Mormon leader thought, hey, if we legalize women voting, it's going to boost our vote more than it boosts theirs. And they did it. And Utah is one of the very first states, in the first early handful, to give women the right to vote. But it all moves from west toward the east, women's suffrage.
I think we have time for one more question.
One more. Okay, sir.
So, in the early American age, you had all these people move because of their religion and the fact they were being persecuted in their own country for their belief. Well, the fact that they moved over here, what role, I mean, it's somewhat weaves its way into the government. So what role does the government play in with the religion?
Well, okay. I suppose a state that illustrates your point very well is Rhode Island. The first people to settle in Rhode Island were mostly Baptists, and Baptists were persecuted terribly in European countries. Generally, whether the country was Catholic or Protestant, they'd persecute Baptists. So they go to Rhode Island, and the Baptists make Rhode Island the first model of freedom of religion. They say, okay, there's not going to be any effort by the government to promote some religion or other. It's just completely helter-skelter, or whatever you want to call it. Everybody can have their own religion and do it their own way. I mean, is that the sort of thing that you're asking about?
More or less.
Yeah. Okay. So by the time the American Revolution comes along, there's an enormous diversity of religions in what is about to become the United States, because so many people have come, seeking to escape persecution. The Quakers get Pennsylvania started because Quakers were being persecuted in England. The Catholics get Maryland started. By the way, it's named for an English queen, Maryland. It's not named for Mary, the mother of Jesus, as some people falsely imagine because they know that the Catholics were important in creating it. So a lot of states have a lot of different religions in them. The New England states are more homogeneous than most of the other states are. And that's why the Congregationalist state establishments last longer, you see, than the other states. State establishments.
Thank you.
Okay.